I was born on the 4th of May 1933 in the house, as was the custom in these days, at 107 Loretta Street, Carntine, but I have absolutely no memory of the occasion. Carntine was a new housing estate on the east end of Glasgow, and when you went east of Carntine there was nothing but green fields in those days. Since then many new areas like Barlanark and Easterhouse and so on have grown up, but when we lived in Carntine that was really the end of the world. My parents were Christians. My father was a precision engineer to trade, and from my very earliest days they taught me the stories of the Bible, and my father never left the house without just getting down to pray and ask that God would protect us while we were away. Well, from my earliest days I was taken down to Bethany Hall in Bridgeton, which was one of the very large mission halls in Glasgow. I remember attending the Sunday school there. We were given a little orange-coloured hymn book each year called the Scottish National Hymn Book for the Young. It might have suited the SNP of today, but we got a stamp on that book each week we attended. And if you had sufficient attendance, then you got a prize at the end of the session. In that hymn book, there were some lovely hymns which we learned and which remain with me till this day. Tell me the story of Jesus, write on my heart every word. Tell me the story most precious, sweeter that ever was heard, and many others like that. Well, I have vivid recollections of the early days of the Second World War and of my father erecting an Anderson air raid shelter up the side of the garden. After he had erected the corrugated iron sheets, some of the local boys were making a pound or two, or it was a bob or two in these days, by going and collecting grass clods, or turfs as we would call them today, which were put over the air raid shelter to camouflage it from the air. And I have vivid recollections of being down to that shelter on many occasions when the sirens sounded. One night in particular, I remember we left our beds no less than 5 times to go down during an air raid, and then later the all clear would sound and we'd be able to return to the house again. But in 1941, that was the year of the Clydebank Blitz, and possibly the same week, I remember looking from the air raid shelter and seeing the whole sky lit up, and we heard the explosions, although they were comparatively distant from Carntine. But there was one night that same week when the sirens sounded, and my mother was bathing my young sister by the fireside. And when the sirens sounded, she wrapped her in a towel to try to get down to the shelter. But before that happened, we heard bombs whistling through the air. They made a kind of eerie sound to try and terrorize people. And there was an explosion, and then another one, and then one that was slightly more distant. The whole house shook, and it was quite a frightening sound. After the raid, my father went out to investigate, and we discovered that the bomb had fallen not in Loretta Street, but in Wartime Street, which was the adjacent street. If that bomb had come through our roof that night, we wouldn't be here to tell the tale. And there was another bomb dropped in Gartcraig Road, which was just at the right angles to where we lived, and it was a time bomb, so no one was allowed near that for several days. So I recall that my father, after the raid, went out to a telephone box because we had no phone in the house, and he phoned my uncle, who was a minister in the small village of East Kilbride, long before there was a town in East Kilbride, and asked if there was any chance that he could give us a room in the manse to get us away from the danger of these bombs that were falling so close by. So on the following morning, the 17th of March 1941, we all moved up to East Kilbride, and we were there for several months until Hitler turned his attention on Russia, and the immediate danger in this area was past for the meantime. My uncle's church was Moncrief Church, East Kilbride. It was a Church of Scotland at that time, but the same building is now known as East Mains Baptist Church, and there's another Moncrief Church up in another part of the town. And the manse was quite an extensive building. There was a very large basement where there were ping pong tables, and I used to go down with my cousins and watch them playing. Each day we had to go to school from there, and we were told at school that if the sirens went, there were no air raid shelters in East Kilbride, just to run home. It wasn't far to go because we were living in the village. We were living there at the time when Rudolf Hess descended in a parachute at a farm in Eaglesham, and of course he was immediately arrested, and at the Nuremberg trials he was sentenced to life imprisonment. In January of that year, my grandmother died, and that was the first time that I had encountered death within the family, and it had quite a profound effect upon me. It was decided that my grandfather would come to live with us for the remainder of his days, which was at 976 Cumbernauld Road in Ridley. Now, of course, there was no television in these days, but my grandfather had a little table by his chair at the fireside, and there were usually some books on that table that I would pick up and look at. But there's one book in particular that seemed to capture my interest in a very special way. It was called Mended Crockery, and I gathered from what I read of it that it was the story of a family in the town of Sunderland, a great shipbuilding centre. And the Connollys were quite a wild family. They were involved in gang warfare and quite a source of trouble to the community. But the people in the little mission hall there showed great interest and compassion in them. And the wonderful thing was that Peter Connolly got converted, and then several other members of the family got converted after that. But in that book, there was a group of photographs in the centre of the book, and there was a picture of Peter Connolly before conversion, and on the other side a picture of Peter after conversion. And that used to fascinate me and help me to say to myself, there must be something in this gospel. Now, it was sometime after that my father said to me, this would be possibly in 1945, my father said to me, I'll take you down to the tent hall on Saturday night, because there's a preacher called Peter Connolly who's going to be preaching, and I'd like you to hear him. And we went down to the tent hall. Now, the tent hall was the largest evangelistic centre in Glasgow. Beautiful building shaped like an arena. It seated 2,200 people, and some nights they had to carry in extra seats to accommodate the crowds who came. And Peter Connolly preached that night. I can still remember his text. He preached from Acts 16 and 30. What must I do to be saved? And preached with great power, a very challenging message. And then he turned things round and he said, what must I do to be lost? And he said, you just do nothing. Just continue on your way, rejecting the gospel, failing to respond to the challenge that God brings to your heart in a meeting like this. And that's how you'll be lost. And at the close of the meeting, he invited people who wanted to be converted to stand to their feet. And several people did. But I didn't have the courage to do so, although I was deeply convicted that I ought to do so. But I went home quite deeply troubled at that time. And then it was again still in 1945, some months or maybe weeks later, that my father said to me, we'll go down to the tent hall on Saturday night because this is Jock Troop's last weekend as superintendent there. And I remember Jock Troop preached with great power that night. But there was a phrase which he kept repeating towards the end of his message. He said, it might be your last chance. It might be your last chance. And he was trying to persuade men and women to come to Christ. I went home very convicted that night that I hadn't responded to the invitation for a second time. But in my bedroom, I vowed before God that if he would give me just one more chance, then I would seize it with both hands. And I didn't have too long to wait, because it was in January of 1946. It was a Sunday evening, and I think either my sister or myself or both of us had been unwell. And my father said that he would stay in with us that evening and allow my mother to go down to Bethany Hall, which she did. And when she came home, we were having a cup of tea around the fireside, and she told us that she had come home in the tram car that night with a lady, Mrs. Carson, whose daughter had been recently converted, and she said, oh, what a change it has made in her life. And I knew that this was the moment that I ought to do something. And my father said, that's something you've never done yet, Gordon. And my heart was ready for it. And I said, well, I would like to do it now. And right there by the fireside, I got down on my knees. I didn't need to be told what to do. I knew fine, I'd heard the message time after time. But there, I confessed my need before the Lord and asked for his forgiveness and for his salvation. And I knew when I rose from my knees that the transaction was done, that I was saved. I was grateful to folks who encouraged me. I was learning the concertina at the time. And there was a little man, Jimmy Woods, who invited me to come and play my concertina with them at the open air. Oh, I said, I'm not at that stage yet. He said, you come out along with the rest of us and you'll soon learn to play. And I was able to use it in various spheres, including the work at the prison in which I was involved. And then ultimately there came an opportunity to be involved in a programme on BBC Two.
That's just such a fabulous sound. It's amazing.
We hope it is.
I would never ever have associated the concertina with evangelism, but I'm clearly very wrong. When did this all begin?
Well, before my lifetime in any case, we both grew up in the mission halls of Glasgow, and they were very widely used there, both for the inside services and also for open-air meetings, which were held at many of the street corners and in the back courts. We had teams of concertina players in most of these mission halls.
Teams of concertina players?
Yes, quite literally.
How many were in a team?
Maybe half a dozen.
Really?
Yes.
And all playing in harmony like that?
Well, we hope it was harmony anyway.
Would you play something else for me?
Yes. Stand Up for Jesus.
One of the great privileges in my life was to be involved in the 1955 Kelvin Hall crusade with Billy Graham. I was both a steward and a counsellor for the 6 weeks of the crusade, and the building in the background here was packed to capacity for every single night of these 6 weeks, and many people came to know Christ during these days. Many of them went into full-time Christian service, spreading the gospel to others too. I got a part-time summer job just prior to leaving school with a company in Glasgow, the Clan Asbestos and Rubber Company, and they had a branch in Belfast. And one of the jobs I had to do was to wheel stuff down to the Belfast boat, which came right up to the Broomielaw in these days. That was before the Kingston Bridge was built. The first permanent job I got was with a firm of chartered patent agents who were in an office in St Vincent Place in Glasgow. And then later I had the opportunity of going back to the Clan Asbestos and Rubber Company in a full-time basis, and I was with them for several years. They gave me the opportunity of going on the road as a salesman, which was very much after my own heart, and ultimately I joined my father in business. I travelled as far as Orkney and Shetland and out to the Western Isles, and sometimes over to Northern and Southern Ireland, and I particularly enjoyed that. I linked after my father retired, and we became Haxton and Lang, and eventually we acquired premises in Uddingston. It was an old school annex building, but it was sited right beside the M74 motorway, which had been recently constructed, and we were there for a good number of years, and we have good memories of the happy times there. I have quite vivid recollections of walking with my mother when she was going to visit her mother in Ridley, and we travelled through an area called Ridley Knowes, and from there we could see a very large building which she explained to me was Barlinnie Prison, and she explained to me what a prison was. And eventually, when we moved house to Cumbernauld Road ourselves, in 1941, and I was shown my back bedroom. My window was overlooking the walls of Barlinnie Prison. It was still during wartime and you couldn't buy toys in the shop, but my father made me a bogie, kind of Oor Willie style, a plank of wood and a set of old pram wheels. And I used to have great fun with that. I would take it over to a slope where the present car park for Barlinnie is now sited, and I would cascade down the hill. And all of that aroused an interest in Barlinnie Prison. And then I had a friend, John Nimmo, who was part of the Bible class team there. And he was very keen that my father and I would come with our concertinas to play at the Bible class one Sunday afternoon. But the problem was I wasn't yet 18 years of age. But the moment I reached my 18th birthday, John got us roped in. So I accepted that invitation, little realising that it would eventually be 65 years in Barlinnie, because the full mantle of responsibility for leadership of the class fell on my shoulders.
Mr. Gordon Haxton, for services to prisoner welfare at Her Majesty's Prison, Barlinnie.
We reached literally thousands of men over the years. We had very good support from the governors and from the chaplains down through the years, and it also brought me into touch with many gifted Christian people in the west of Scotland who came as visiting speakers to participate in the class. And on the whole, Barlinnie was a major part in my Christian service. Well, eventually Bethany Hall in Bernard Street had to close down, but there were quite a number of the workers who were keen to continue the witness, and they were able to acquire a very nice hall on the basement of the YWCA of Scotland building in Muslin Street. And I became the secretary there, and we had very gifted men from various parts of the world who came, and we had very fruitful years of evangelism there. And it was while there that I first came into touch with Eleanor Fitch, who was to be my wife. She was the daughter of Jimmy Fitch, who was a very well-known pianist in evangelical circles in the west of Scotland. And eventually we were married in 1964, and we came to live in Uddingston. It was during these years in Uddingston that God gifted us with our family, who have been very precious to us. There was Joyce, born in 1965, Colin in 1968, and Clifford in 1970. During these years too, we associated with the Little Brethren Hall in Uddingston, Union Hall, and we were particularly involved in a children's work. We called it Monday Special, and most Monday nights we would have in the region of about 100 children present who sang very heartily and listened very intently to the message. And we have had fruit coming back from these days too, which has been very encouraging. I've always been very fond of travel, and having been blessed with so many years of retirement and good health, I've been able to make quite a number of journeys to many places. I've been to Switzerland, I've been to Devon and Cornwall, I've been to the far north of Scotland, and lots of lovely day trips with family members. And when I'm on my own, I like to go by train, and it takes me to various destinations throughout the United Kingdom. So off to the station again. As I've now reached my 90th birthday and look back, I'm grateful to God for all His goodness down through these years. And I can truly say that the greatest thing of all has been simply to know Christ and His presence with me day by day. There was a man who came to Bethany Hall many years and sang a solo which deeply touched my heart. And I would like just to read these couple of verses to you. If I had 1,000 lives to live, I'd live them all for Jesus. If I had 1,000 hearts to give, I'd give them all to Him. 1,000 tongues to sing His praise could not tell half His wondrous ways. If I had 1,000 lives to live, I'd give them all to Jesus.
Jesus.